HBR presents.
Hello, my name is Azim Azar, and you're listening to the Exponential View podcast. Every week, I'm in deep conversation with a brilliant mind, exploring the exponential era through which we are all living. Now, this podcast is multidisciplinary. What does that mean? Well, some weeks you'll hear me discuss our future with a scientist. Other episodes might involve an investor, a technologist, a politician, a writer, or in this case, an economist. In these uncertain times, when the rate of technological change is ever increasing, I want to offer you some of the best perspectives and most insightful thinking on the opportunities and challenges that lie ahead. Now, before we get on to this week's conversation, one request, please, if you're listening to us on iTunes, give us a 5-star review. It really helps other people find this podcast. So one thing I ask of you, podcast discovery is kind of broken. So a 5-star review if you're listening on iTunes. If you're not listening on iTunes, just sharing it to a few friends via email or on Facebook or Twitter is really helpful. Thanks very much. My guest today is Carlota Perez, one of the world's leading experts on the impact of technological change on economic growth. I have been a massive fan of Carlota's since I read her book, Technological Revolutions and Financial Capital, nearly a decade ago. It is a must-read text for anyone who wants to understand technological change in the context of financial capital and the economy. It's much beloved by serious investors in technology. If you've read my newsletter, Exponential View, you've certainly been exposed to her thinking. I refer to it very frequently. In this conversation, we dig into the different stages of technological change, the booms and the busts and the golden ages, why they happen, how they spread, and what we might be able to expect this time around. I try to unpick Carlota's thinking on the drivers behind the complex relationship between innovation, capitalism, and politics. And who would have guessed that while many of us struggle to keep a positive outlook on the future, Carlota is quietly and increasingly optimistic. Well, let's start with the framework that really put your thinking on the map and has proven to be a roadmap for so many people investing in technology, which was technological revolutions and financial capital. Now, in that, you identified that waves of technological innovation are accompanied by a set of stages that have some commonalities that result in fundamental changes to society. It's a lot to ask, but in a nutshell, could you summarize what those waves look like?
Okay, first of all, the subtitle of my book was The Dynamics of Bubbles and Golden Ages. What that means is that somehow the way that capitalism works, the way that technical change occurs, is not only by technological revolutions, which are inevitable. When a technological revolution occurs, it's because the previous technological revolution is exhausted. Normally, innovation happens along certain tracks. With every type of revolution, you have a sequence of similar things, but better and better and better. I mean, we went from the mobile phone that did only phone, was a phone, to a mobile phone that's actually a computer. And it's telecommunications, and it's also your GPS, and it's also everything else.
But each of these are dependent on a core infrastructure that has to be laid out. In the case of electricity, generation and distribution lines and power sockets in homes.
Exactly. So what you have is every technological revolution sets up an infrastructure, gives a whole set of new directions for innovation, provides technologies that allow for greater productivity in almost every industry and every service. It changes the way that people produce and the way that people live. Lifestyles change each time. So you actually get a set of interrelated things that guide innovation and guide profitability and guide both production styles and lifestyles. But at one point, it's over. No matter how much you invest or you try to invest along the same path, you just find that you don't have any more products, you don't have any more services, which is what happened in the late 1960s and early 70s.
You've argued that technological revolutions happen cyclically and that there are some common stages in them. What are those stages?
Okay, the first stage is the first assimilation, the big experiment, when you bring all the new technologies and you have a lot of people experimenting, and then you end up with everybody getting excited about it and finance jumping in, and you get a bubble at the end and a huge collapse. And that period is called installation, where you both install the infrastructure, which is one of the main components of the bubble, and you also install something very important, which is the paradigm. The logic, the common sense of this technological revolution is learned as people use it. And by the time you have the bubble, everybody understands what this is about.
For many of us listening, we'll be very familiar with that because we will have seen the dot-com bubble by the time we engaged with it in the 1995, 96, 97 time. Venture capital, speculative finance had already been investing in the semiconductors, the networking equipment, the first internet services. And by the time that bubble burst in 2000, 2001, a large part of modern Western business was comfortable with the idea of websites and sending email. So that sort of fits the pattern that you've described.
But don't forget that there was another bubble in 2008, and that had to do with globalization and with the total digitization of the information and money market. The whole of the financial world became then totally global, totally digital, and all instruments, synthetic instruments, all these things that created the bubble. So in a way, the first bubble was about technology itself. And the second wave, the second bubble, was about using technology in finance and in globalization. So we have two bubbles, and we might still have a third one before we get to the end. So what happens after bubbles is a recession. This recession in particular is very peculiar because it's not really a recession. It was like for a couple of years. But what it is
after
not
the 2008 financial crisis.
Yeah, after 2008, we didn't really have a recession like we had in the 1930s, which is the equivalent. What we've had is a sort of trap with interest rates around zero and with growth sort of slow and nothing really happening, while finance is in a wild casino making lots of money and growing, doubling the stock markets, whereas actual production and actual jobs and all those things are not really growing because finance is in this casino and is not really investing in production. But normally after the bubbles, you get a recessive period when everything that happened during the installation period in terms of inequality, in terms of job losses, in terms of skill destruction, regional destruction, come to the fore. And as they come to the fore, people become angry and you have lots of unrest and you get populism. So the last time we got Hitler, we got Stalin, but at that point you get this unrest and you get political parties divide, new ideas come, new movements, new social, all sorts of new things. But until those things come together and the tide really turns, that's why I call it a turning point, because it's the moment at which the things that were wrong during the installation period become part of what has to be solved. Mm-hmm. And it has to be solved with the things that were installed during the installation period, which is the new technologies. So the new technologies become the instrument, and the goals are overcoming, reversing all the bad things that the experimental bubble type period made. So it's a very complex political period. It's a very complex because ideas and ideologies from the previous period that were solving the previous problems are no longer any good. They're useless.
Yeah. And that's why what we see, certainly looking after the 1930s depression, we see a number of things emerging in terms of salaried jobs, employment contracts, welfare systems, whether they're privately or state provided. That's the moment when fridges and irons and TVs made their way into sort of mass penetration into people's lives and homes.
Yes, what follows the turning point, what follows this sort of depressive or slow growth period is a golden age. The golden ages of capitalism, the Victorian boom, the Belle Epoque, the post-war boom, they all come after these collapses and these recessions and what I call the turning point. And this is a moment when government comes in and gives direction to all those technologies that have been installed, and the direction has to somehow involve improving the social conditions, because both government and business want peace. And social peace you don't obtain without making well-being, reaching well-being.
So if we look at where we are today in this revolution, where it seems like we're somewhere between the frenzy and the turning point, but perhaps just knocking on the door of the golden age, but we haven't yet chosen which one to open. Is that a
Yes.
reasonable timing?
I would say that the whole thing about the turning point, this turning point, has lasted almost as much as the 1930s. We began in 2008 and we're still not there. However, I see that the door is being opened. There are many signs that show that the idea of worrying about well-being, of what's being called stakeholder capitalism rather than shareholder capitalism, is getting stronger and stronger and more common. Why? Because every golden age is about a positive-sum game. It's about a win-win game between society and business.
Right.
Business knows that demand is important, that peace is important. And when it gets so bad that everybody starts saying capitalism is not any good, it's not working, they worry. And, it's in their interest. We now need the proper leaders and the proper programs, and we probably need the digital natives to start really worrying about how to set up the context for a better world.
When we say that there is an increasing concern over whether capitalism is fit for purpose, are we actually taking a view that says we need something other than capitalism, or are we saying this particular configuration of capitalism has got its limits and we now need to reconfigure it, but the thing that comes out is still recognizably capitalism?
I mean, if I were in the middle of the 1930s and somebody said, look, you see those guys there in the food line, soup line, getting something, really looking ragged and thin and so on, and say, all those people are going to have a home. They're going to have a car at the door. The home is going to be full of electrical appliances. The children are going to go to free schools, probably to university, and they're going to have a wonderful life.
Yeah.
I would have said, you are talking about a dream. You're not talking about capitalism. Capitalism doesn't do that. And how it did it was by a very clear process. The first thing was that during the war in the US, it was necessary to produce planes and bombs and things in huge quantities. And business then, industry, had to apply the new mass production technologies that were being applied to radio and to automobiles and so on, to building airplanes and bombs and weapons. So when they did this, they realized what a wonderful thing it was to have a huge demand for their products, and for that huge demand to be paid by government, because it was taxes that paid for this. When the war was over, what are we going to do now? So what happened then was that they were very happy and agreed to have the welfare state, which is a way of paying high taxes, giving them to government then turning that into the welfare state, which created demand, which created then two forms of demand. One associated with suburbanization and home ownership, and the other associated with the Cold War. It made it possible for banks to not worry about lending to people on salaries because the government was backing it. So you promoted home ownership. Why? Because once you owned the home, you then needed to fill them. And you filled them with refrigerators, and then you had to fill the refrigerator with cold food and with that. And then you had to package all those foods with plastics. So then plastics were invented for this and that. So you had this whole amazing demand growing, which was very profitable. And
But
on the other hand,
you couldn't have planned for that at the beginning. So when you...
What do you mean you couldn't have planned for that at the beginning? Of course you planned. That was the whole idea. In fact, Keynes told Roosevelt in the middle of the 30s, when he was desperate, what can I do to get jobs and so on? Keynes told him, I would put all my eggs in the housing basket, because that is what's going to create the basis for.
You could plan at that level, but you couldn't plan the path that technological development would have taken that would have resulted in your avocados being pre-peeled and packaged in cellophane.
You are talking about something else. Because the thing of shaping how the lifestyle becomes is one very general thing. You don't then choose how specifically you're going to do it. It's creativity, innovation, business,
Right.
all these things that happen. But the creativity that was there in the government to make the institutions that would create the conditions for home ownership to happen and to become normal. And then another thing, government did something very interesting, FDR. Roosevelt, he actually legalized labor unions, but not just labor unions, industry unions. What did that mean? That you had the auto workers union, so that every union in every auto working company would sit down together with all the companies, and between them, they would agree fantastic deals, because of course, like Ford said, my workers will be able to buy the cars.
Mm-hmm.
They all guaranteed that if all the workers got better conditions and better money and weekends to consume and holidays to consume in, all this context would help everybody. And all the industry unions would work with every industry, so you had oligopolistic competition. So that was also an innovation.
Why does that process run out of steam, though?
And that runs out of steam for a very simple purpose, because mass production as a paradigm ran out of steam. And what they had to do, because they couldn't innovate to increase productivity, then business moved out of the advanced world and went to the developing world and did import substitution.
Mm-hmm.
And then eventually they managed to go to Asia. And in the end, China opened its market to investment. Because don't forget that the whole idea of the post-war boom was very high wages and very cheap energy, with the idea that the high salaries were compensated by the low cost of energy. But as soon as the paradigm was over, you could increase the price of energy, which happened so the price of energy went up, because it was no longer necessary to have cheap energy, because the mass production model was over and you now had low-cost labor. So when a paradigm is over, everything about it is over. And then the thing, when you have a new paradigm, then everything about it is being constructed and decided. So now, if it would be best to have very expensive materials, very expensive energy, so that people will start really doing the good thing for the planet, which is consume less per unit of product.
Right.
More dematerializing of everything.
So by the time we get to the late 60s or the early 70s, when mass production has worked its way through to its limit, we're about 60 years on from when Ford created his first production lines for the car, which kicked off that wave. Is there anything significant about that period of time, that 6 decades?
No. Society does it in whichever way it can. Some periods have been shorter, some others have been longer. One of the reasons why this technological revolution has lasted so long, I think there are many reasons, actually. The first reason is that it's a globalization, so it takes a long time to go through all the processes of go from one country to the other. The second thing is that it's the first time that it's a revolution based on information technology. And this could make it the first of a new series. It's possible that we are now going to go through a new series, which will then go into biotech and whatever else, that is based on sort of an artificial intelligence world. We're now talking about this other world. And in this other world, there are many new things happening, because it's the first time that many things that were never a product, that were never a service, that were never part of the market system, have entered the market system. And this changes the conditions, and it widens the space of penetration into people's lives that the markets do, which is quite tough. So another reason, which might not be looked at by people, is the glass ceiling for the young. We are living much longer. People are living 80, 90 years. So Instead of retiring at 60 or 65, the leaders of companies and governments and everywhere are retiring at 70 or 75 or even 80. There are presidential candidates that are 70 years old, and it's perfectly normal. So that means that both in politics and in business, in universities and everywhere else, people who are from the previous revolution are still governing. And in order to change everything, in order to be able to regulate the FANGs, for instance, you have to have digital natives. Only digital natives can really think of how to regulate these huge companies.
In a sense, we might be in the equivalent of the 1930s. The bubble has burst, and we need to find ways of designing investment and rules and norms that create a new golden age. What seems to have happened after the 2008 bubble was that governments stepped in with unproductive capital, quantitative easing, things that fix the financial system but not the real economy. How should you think about what steps need to be taken to create a new golden age off the back of this new technological revolution?
We have to think in terms of direction for convergence in innovation. Because one of the things that people have not understood is that the whole of the green issue, the whole environmental issue, is an enormous opportunity for investment, for innovation, for changing lifestyles, for changing production processes. I mean, it's avenues and avenues of innovation that are opened by that. And at the same time, we need social sustainability. So we need a new welfare state, not the old one, which responded to jobs for life and all these things, but a new one that responds to the gig economy, self-employment, platform careers, mobility, all these new things, and of course, a service economy and a digitalized economy. The state itself has to modernize in all sorts of ways. So government itself has to change, and it has to change in a way that's good for both business and society. And that way, in my view, is actually two things. One is smart green growth, and the other is full global development.
What do you mean by smart green growth?
Smart green growth is actually the use of information technology in order to reduce the material content in lifestyles and the material context in world trade and in production. So information technology by its nature is intangible. But of course, we don't sit on intangible things and we don't sleep on intangible beds. We do need material things. However, they don't have to last 2 years or 5 years. They can last 100 years. And they can be updated and changed. And we can 3D print whatever we need in order to change things. And we could rent rather than buy, so that we can change every time we want. Do you realize that if we were to apply the American way of life just to China, we would need 3 planets?
Don't have enough planets.
We don't have enough planets for the Chinese to have the American way of life with the typical change your refrigerator every 5 years. We need a society that uses resources very intelligently.
I mean, one of my favorite examples of this, the Haber-Bosch process. So the Haber-Bosch process, which fixes nitrogen out of the air so that we can create ammonia for fertilizers, is a classic industrial age process. It requires massive amounts of energy to generate high temperatures and high pressures. It's not very smart. It's brute force and an avenue of very active research that brings together some cutting edge technologies in terms of molecular biology, systems biology, and quantum computing is an attempt to figure out how we can fix nitrogen out of the atmosphere at much lower energy states and much lower energy levels. So it's a good example because the global energy use that goes into nitrogen fixation is measured in single-digit percentage points. I mean, it's a lot. It's a big chunk. And scientific research could drastically affect that.
That is one of literally tens of thousands of innovation opportunities that have to do with materials, that have to do with everything.
So the first side of it was smart green growth. What was the second dimension?
Full global development. We could transform almost every country with one huge advantage for the advanced world. And it is that because the mass production of consumer goods is gone to Asia, and it's not going to come back, period. If it comes back with robots. So what is it that the advanced world could produce that needs demand? And that is capital goods, engineering, education, all sorts of high-tech things,
Mm-hmm.
which a world that would be developing would be needing. And as the world develops, it would increase the well-being of those countries. There would be trade, of course, because they would be trading for these capital goods and all these engineering things and so on. And that would mean also a reduction in migration. So a lot of the problems of today would actually be solved by doing that. But you need to be able to both fund and help.
So you're describing two very distinct types of products. So one type is capital goods, so sort of heavy, physical, hard to build things, and the other was intellectual
Which have to
goods,
be green, by the way.
which have to be green heavy things. Yeah. And the other was things that are rooted in experience but intangible, so education.
Yes.
And they're very distinct. And I suppose we are seeing the first tendrils of those as British and American universities open campuses throughout Asia and Africa and
the Middle
so
East.
On, and the Middle East. Yeah,
exactly. That is one of the things that is big. And it isn't just universities, because if you want to develop, you also need a lot of other skills, which are not sort of university type, but you have the whole of the technical world to do. But you need to fund that. So we need a financial transactions tax. And it's ridiculous that finance has been opposing that, because that would be the best way to make sure that there is actual growth. Now, the whole idea would be that any transaction, say above $5,000 or something like that, would pay 0.5%, 1%, whatever, whichever way it goes. You can also have another different one for investment and capital gains. So the whole idea, if people understand like they understood in the post-war period, that the money that you pay in taxes goes through government hands and turns into demand through what government does, either procurement or social things or whatever. Universal basic income. It's so obvious that it's a solution. It can be done through artificial intelligence. You do it through the ATM. Everybody gets it, millionaires included, and they give it back with a tax increase. And this increases demand, increases opportunities, increases innovation, and it provides an incredible cushion for everybody, for young people to innovate.
If you look at the UK, this speaks to the heart of the political divide. You've described how this new world, this golden age, will be designed by digital natives who are typically younger. If you look at the UK right now, there's a lot of tax benefits in seeing capital gains on your primary property. Inheritance tax is extremely low. All of those systems appeal to the non-digital natives who have come out of the age of the automobile and the age of the telephone and traditional electricity. They also happen to have much higher rates of political participation when it comes to voting. And yet virtually every change that you've described requires taxing them on gains they've made against the previous paradigm, which was the accepted paradigms.
That's what I was saying when I said that this paradigm had lasted longer than others, because the rate at which the people are dying is much lower. I mean, but that's true.
Yeah.
So you get the young, yes, they're entering, but their proportion does not grow as fast as it grew 100 years ago. So the whole problem of the glass ceiling for women is now paired by a glass ceiling for young. You know, this whole idea that you have to have purpose and meaning and all that in order to get young people to come to your company. Companies are understanding that really these are different people and you need to cater to their needs in order for them to cater to your needs as a business, to become really creative and really interested in doing what you're interested in doing.
One interesting economic configuration that we're starting to see is the platform company, and the platform company that supports either gig working or renting rather than buying. And this seems to be a new industrial configuration compared to the old vertical integration of shareholder companies. What we're also learning from these companies is that they don't necessarily address all of the issues of social sustainability and environmental sustainability. So we know, for example, if you take a company like Uber or Lyft, that the vast bulk of the value that is created goes back to a handful of very privileged founder shareholders, rather than to the drivers doing the work. So they don't seem to solve a sort of inequality problem. And we also know that they tend to increase congestion within cities because the urban architecture hasn't been designed for this. If you look in other spaces, these platform companies tend to have really appealing business models with very, very high profit margins when they get profitable, because they establish small micro monopolies around the data that they collect around the transactions on either side of this equation. So it seems to me that what needs to then change actually is our rules around intellectual property with respect to data, our rules around how we define monopoly and monopoly power. And if we don't change those rules, we'll end up creating quite a large set of monopolies or pseudo-monopoly companies rather than achieving this goal of an inclusive, sustainable growth that you've described.
Okay, that's a very complex process.
Yeah.
I think the most likely is that in the end, there will be corporations made up of drivers who will own the thing rather than these guys. Because the model is very easy to copy. The whole problem is, of course, you have a little group of drivers, they cannot do it. You've got to do something big. So in the end, you'll probably have to set up some form of cooperative system so that people will be able to both even out their income and have some social security and all that. But all these processes have to be fostered. You have to change the tax system. You have to change the rules. You have to change the regulation.
Yeah, that calls for a greater role of the state. And it seems that over the last 25 or 30 years, the state has felt that its job has always been about value for money more than anything else. I mean, that efficiency has been the mantra of what it was to be a good state. How do we go about changing how the state conceives of its role and the demands that are now put upon it during this design phase?
I want you to make two distinctions. One is, what did the state do during the golden age post-war? It did everything social. It did all sorts of, it innovated. It innovated in institutions. It created, I mean, just think, for instance, of unemployment insurance. Unemployment insurance sounds like it's for the workers, right? If you don't have a job, you get money. No, it's for both.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you would have had all the cars coming back and the refrigerators and the mortgages, the keys. So that was for both. That's a win-win game. And that was a brilliant solution to a situation where you had jobs for life, but every so often you did. And you had high salaries, therefore you could have credit. I mean, the whole thing, but it was designed by the state. And at the same time, the state was innovating in computers, was innovating in internet, was funding all sorts of other innovations that ended up being the future revolution and also made life at that time much better in all sorts of ways. But from the 70s onward, when that model was finished and business was no longer interested in it, they put enough pressure on the state to be hands-off. And as the state came hands-off, that's the state you're talking about, the one that's worried about efficiency. But that's only during the installation period.
Right.
You know, if a CEO in a big company had results like the austerity policies had, he would be out in 2 years. We've had austerity for I don't know how many years. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work. So why don't they stop it? This is a very strange thing. But fortunately, the tide is turning. Everybody's now talking not only about stakeholder capitalism, but even Zuckerberg says, regulate me, you know. So somehow it's understood that the state has to regulate. Somehow it's understood that the state should modernize. And the state is capable of innovating. And you need to attract innovative people into the state because it has to become exciting again. Golden ages are very clearly state-led. When you get a golden age, it's because the state is shaping it. And that means taxing. Finance has to be taxed properly. We should have very high taxes for anything, any operation, anything that you earn within one day, like with the fast finance and all this thing, 92% tax. That's not unique. That happened in the 1950s. So you get 92% tax for anything within 1 day, 80% tax for anything within 1 month, 50% or 60% tax for anything within 1 year, zero tax, 10 years. So you actually get finance to be interested in long term, because without long term, we don't have proper innovation.
This new golden age will mean that we'd live our lives in different ways. Our lifestyles would be different. How would we get there and what would it look like?
Well, that is a very important point, because one of the things that I've been holding with data is that, in fact, each revolution destroys a lot of jobs, destroys a lot of skills, creates quite a few, but not enough. And what creates the big bulk of the new jobs is the new lifestyle, which in turn has been facilitated by the new technologies. And now we need a very environmentally friendly lifestyle where people will see their desires centered on health, centered on creativity, on exercise, on experiences, on all sorts of things that are intangible. And at the same time, instead of centering on possession, we would be renting and we would be moving. We would be moving around, probably moving around with less and less energy consumption, but basically the whole idea of having a very interesting lifestyle. And every time, every technological revolution has changed the lifestyle, but it doesn't change it in just any direction, but in a direction that has already been signaled by the young, by the educated, and by the rich. So in each revolution, you see what the young do. Well, that's the way things go. So there is a lot to do. It's a lot of creativity that's necessary, and therefore you need people who are creative and imaginative, who want to be working with government in order to make these transformations. And stop thinking that the government is stupid and bureaucratic. The government became bureaucratic when it could no longer do what it was doing, which was fantastic. Nobody accused the government of being bureaucratic in the 1950s.
Right.
They were all very happy.
So we are in the turning point of this technological revolution that started in the early 1970s with the microchips from Intel and others. Do you feel optimistic or pessimistic about what comes next?
Well, I'll tell you the truth. I used to always say I'm the most pessimistic optimist you'll ever meet. And suddenly, in the past few months, the tide is turning. It's in the past few months. The tide is turning, and it's turning in business, and it's turning in society. And I am now beginning to become an optimist. I'm still worried about the leaders. I don't see where the leaders are. But society is pushing, and when society pushes, leaders emerge.
Carlota Perez, what a fantastic conversation we've just had. If listeners want to find out more about your work or follow you on Twitter or read your blog, what's the best way to do that?
Well, the easiest is probably my own webpage, carlotaperez.org. And my Twitter handle is at Carlota Perez, PRZ in the middle, because I am actually Perez being a Venezuelan. We use two surnames, and it so happens that both my mother and my father were Perez.
Thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you very much for the interview.
Well, thank you for listening. That is one of my favorite conversations. I'm such a huge fan of Carlota's, and it was just an incredible honor to be able to spend a morning with her. Do check out the archives for more thoughtful conversations about the future and technology. And I also have this weekly newsletter where I discuss a lot of these issues. You can find it at www.exponentialview.co. My name is Azim Azar. The podcast was produced by Maria Gavrilov and Fred Casella. Our sound editor is Boyan Sabiacello, and Exponential View is a production of E to the Pi I +1 Limited.